I'm Dr. Baker Rogers. Most people just simply refer to me as Sissy. So please feel free to do that when we get to Q&A. And my co-author, her name is actually pronounced Fasaha Trailer. I'll start off the program and then she'll join in. We want to begin by first talking about our personal reflections, our thoughts and our experiences as we worked on this book. They carried us, the social impact of Philadelphia's Black women leaders. For me, the women of They Carried Us, they humbled me because it was clear that they believed in my life, that my life had value despite not even knowing me. I've taken many messages from them, but none more important than caring for and helping others. The women who grew up struggling in West Philadelphia have especially touched me because it was my native home and my condition in life as well. Women like Frances Walker, Lynette Brown Sow and her mother, Charmaine Matlock Turner, Denise King, Tina Sloan Green, Joan Myers Brown, Inez Patterson, Sandra Dungy Glenn, Dr. Asali Solomon and her sister Akiba, Reverend Dr. Laurene and Marsha Blake, and Christina James Brown, Aisha Shahida Simmons, Maddie Humphrey, Dr. Emma Chappelle, and Bishop Audrey Brunson. When we talk about them, my thoughts immediately go to who they were as altruistic people. So many of us get up to go to work, but the women of They Carried Us did much more by consistently getting up to go to mission. And so therefore, they each have had somewhat of a spiritual dimension about themselves.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really very, very happy to be here. This is, I really feel very sort of simpatico with the Ethical Society, being a Black humanist myself. In my garage is a homemade sign from 1992. It's white poster board nailed to a 2x4 piece of lumber, and I've kept it all this time. Anita Hill speaks for me, it says. Until this year, I have probably never been as furious as I was after the Clarence Thomas hearings. I was furious enough that when Arlen Specter held a town hall meeting in Germantown, I trekked over there with my sign and held it high for the entire time, marching back and forth alone in front of the entrance as people went in to hear him. It was a turning point for me. I didn't care whether anyone agreed with me or whether his supporters liked me being there or not. I had reached the end of my tolerance for Black women being ignored and disrespected. I was more than a feminist. I was a Black feminist, which meant that I was on the battlefields of both race and sex. I contributed to and signed the full-page New York Times advertisement entitled African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, which expressed our fury in no uncertain terms. A few weeks later, I discovered that there were many other Black women who felt exactly as I did, and together we formed the Ain't I a Woman Network in Philadelphia. We were done. Fast forward to 2014. The battlefields of race, sex, and class are where we found all the women of They Carried Us. I feel so honored to hold up the blood-stained banner for each and every one of them. When Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," he didn't really believe it. We say that based on those he cordoned off from equality for whatever reason. Some historians say that he really meant that all nations were created equal. But whether he meant individual equality and didn't really believe it, or wasn't thinking about individuals at all, Black women in Philadelphia believed in individual equality, fought for individual equality, and helped to develop an ethic of equality within a nationwide thrust to extend civil and human rights to all. The Fortin family was a family of abolitionists during the colonial and antebellum period. And we're citing these early Black women because we believe that they're the foundation of this ethic of equality. Charlotte Fortin bore 9 children, and 3 of their daughters, Margaretta, Harriet, and Sarah, were active in anti-slavery causes through teaching, writing, speaking, fundraising, and running the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. It cannot be emphasized enough, really, that this was an amazing demonstration for women to be in public speaking up about the issues of the day. But they did. Sarah Fortin emphasized racial inequality, saying, and I quote, "It originates from dislike to the color of the skin, much as from the degradation of slavery." She advocated equal treatment. He, referring to her father, has usually 16 or 20 journeymen, 1/2 of whom are white, but I am not aware of any white sailmaker who employs colored men. I think it should be reciprocal. Do not you? Sarah Mapps Douglas came from another abolitionist family, and though she was a Quaker herself, blasted them for their inability to practice equality before God. And I quote, "There is a bench set apart at that meeting, Arch Street meeting, for our people. Whether officially appointed or not, I cannot say. But this I am free to say, that my mother and myself were told to sit there, and that a friend sat at each end of the bench to prevent white persons from sitting there. I have not been in Arch Street for 4 years, but my mother goes once a week, and frequently she has a whole long bench to herself." Jarena Lee, who was the first preacher in the AME denomination, the first woman preacher in the AME denomination, insisted to the newly formed Mother Bethel AME Church of Richard Allen that she, like any man, could preach the word of God. She said, "If the man may preach because the Savior died for him, why not the woman?"
Harriet Tubman believed the enslaved should be freed and that she herself was equally entitled to enter heaven. She said, "Now look here. John saw the city, didn't he? Yes, John saw the city. Well, what did he see? He saw 12 gates, didn't he? 3 of those gates was on the north, 3 of them was on the east, and 3 of them was on the west. But there were 3 more, and them was on the south. And I reckon if they kill me down here, I'll get into one of them gates, don't you?" Frances Ellen Watkins Harper invoked a mother's feeling about slavery. She knew that there was nothing greater than the determination of a mother to free her child from a lifetime of inequality. In her poem titled Eliza Harris Crossing the River on the Ice, she wrote, "Like a fawn from the arrow, startled and wild, a woman swept by us, bearing a child, and her brow was overshadowed with anguish and care. She was nearing the river and reaching its brink. She heeded no danger, she paused not to think. For she is her mother, her child is a slave, and she'll give him his freedom or find him his grave. These women helped develop the ethic of equality in the city of Philadelphia. And this ethic, we believe, was the foundation on which generations of Black women battled for their communities and on behalf of their own and others' civil rights. And to a person, without a doubt, racism permeated all of their experiences. Dr. Rebecca J. Cole, 1846 to 1922, she wrote, "No good work is accomplished unless it is animated and directed by a controlling thought." Her thought was on providing safety nets for women and children while teaching them how to lift themselves up. Instead of simply giving them fish, Rebecca taught them how to fish. And instead of allowing others to blame them and other poor families for their situation, Rebecca redirected the blame where it belonged, on outside forces that were intent on holding blacks down. She was incensed by by class inequality, the denigration of poor people, and especially by what she viewed as deliberate intentionality to sequester them in low-paying labor, substandard housing, and inhumane healthcare. She wrote, "On the point of deaths from consumption, I would say this: hosts of the poor are attended by young, inexperienced white physicians. They inherited the traditions of their elders, and let a Black patient cough, they immediately have visions of tuberculosis. Let him die," and he writes, "tuberculosis," and heaves a great sigh of relief that one more source of contagion is removed. Are colored people largely forced to live in unsanitary districts? And are they more ignorant and careless about the laws of health? Or are they suffering the fates of all exotics? We must attack the system of overcrowding in poor districts, that people may not be crowded together like cattle with soulless landlords, while soulless landlords collect 50% of their investments. These are the things that we can do to attack vice, disease, and crime in their strongholds, where they have no complexion and they always yield such treatment. Rebecca was the second child of 5 mulatto children uh, that were born to formerly enslaved parents. She was the first Black woman to graduate from Women's Medical College in Philadelphia, and she was the second Black woman to become a physician in the United States. She worked for 9 years between the period of 1872 and 1881 as a tenement physician in New York. While there, she spent her time visiting and treating poor families in slum neighborhoods. She taught these families how to improve their family's hygiene, prenatal care, and infant care. She then moved to Columbia, South Carolina for a couple of years, where she set up a private practice doing the same work, and finally returned to Philadelphia in 1894, where she established another private practice. She continued that work while also co-founding the Physician Women's Directory Center. She was convinced that if the hand of friendship were held out to the unfortunate mother, especially before the birth of her child, she could be persuaded to keep her baby. Now, this was important because these were vulnerable women who very often had to leave their children at home unattended while they went to work as domestics. Rebecca also had a special concern for young girls housed in reform schools. They deserve training opportunities for worthwhile employment and not dead-end work, not dead-end domestic work, I should say. She wrote, "If the employment given be of such a nature that the girls themselves are treated as intelligent beings, continuous employment would certainly be a success. Otherwise, it will not. The argument offered against teaching girls useful employment because only domestic service is offered to them is unworthy of those who have the interests of the community at heart. Rebecca also became the superintendent of the government house for children and old women in Washington, D.C. That was in 1899, before she returned to Philadelphia. Once she returned to Philadelphia, she joined the Philadelphia African American Women's Club movement that championed racial and social justice. She also was asked to convene a group of Black women. Now, this was one of her last acts against racial discrimination. She was asked by the all white Ladies Centennial Committee to convene a group of Black women, and she did so immediately. But then she disbanded the group because she learned that Black women were supposed to be a separate arm of the Ladies Centennial Committee, and that she was not having.
Okay, fast forward to 1933 when Dolores Brisbane was born in and grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, where her entire childhood was spent in a segregated community. Her all-Black teachers nurtured her talents, even though neither her family nor her community had much by way of material resources. Her first encounter with the effects of inequality came when she studied nursing at Tuskegee Institute. That was where she learned that the health problems of pregnant Black Alabama women were rooted in the inequality of their socioeconomic conditions. Dolores came to Philadelphia in 1959. She was hired at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital as a head nurse. She learned to roll with the punches she experienced every day: racist remarks, gestures, behaviors, and actions. She decided she would not let her environment change who she was, and eventually she changed her environment. In 1975, after leading the separation of Graduate Hospital from HUP, Dolores was asked to become either the president of Graduate Hospital or to establish a planning office at HUP. She chose the planning office. She had a staff of 12, mostly men, who didn't believe that this was a woman's role, and especially not a Black woman's role. Her years of parrying insults, disrespect, and what we now call microaggressions helped her to navigate the space. When she was asked to become chief operating officer of the hospital, it was the ethic of equality that she staffed her office with women and men who reflected the diversity of the workforce. Prathia Hall, usually when I say her name, I say Prathia, Lord Prathia, was an amazing woman. She was, Reverend Dr. Prathia Hall was born in Philadelphia in 1940 and was a graduate of Girls High. She believed, quote, religion and politics were woven together in the fabric of life. She wanted to be a minister, but as she put it, I knew almost no ordained women ministers who were taken seriously by the church. In 1962, she left Temple University, convinced, quote, that the movement was God's work and also my sacred calling. She joined SNCC. In Southwest Georgia, she developed the concept of what she eventually called freedom faith. And I love this description that she gives of the ambiance of the movement. She said, I had never in my life been so profoundly moved as I was by the mass meetings that were the central rallying points of the movement. They began with the prayer service of the Black Christian tradition. The raised voices and the rhythmic stomping of feet could be heard far in advance of one's arrival at the church ground. The undulating wave of the old call and response lined hymns drew latecomers and visitors into the warm embrace. It was impossible to stand as a spectator outside the circle of this communion. The power with which those songs and prayers were infused transcended the objective reality of our situation, fashioned fear into faith, cringing into courage, suffering into survival, despair into defiance, and pain into protest. She did a lot in the South, in both Southwest Georgia and in Selma, Alabama. She was there for Bloody Sunday, but she left the South and came back to Philadelphia. After graduating from Princeton Theological Seminary, she preached and taught against what she called bondage doctrine. According to her, many of her fellow preachers were teaching a view of, I quote, a view of scripture and the gospel that was grounded in a misreading of the Bible. In her reading, God created two creatures, both containing elements of both genders. She believed ministers should preach a vision of partnership between women and men, and she warned ministers and congregations away from, quote, the sin that is the idolatry of sexism that exalts genital fixations of a sinful culture and dares to blame that bigotry on God. Her practice of the ethic of equality was deeply personal to her. And she wrote, every spring there is a great revival in Philadelphia. The church is at least half full of preachers. For a few years, I attended that revival, desiring to find medicine for my own needy soul. The revivalists came out and thanked God for the presence of all the brother preachers, and then invited all the brother preachers to stand. Sitting in the pew, I was immediately confronted with a crisis of identity. Which do I own? My call or my gender? Do I sit and deny this call, this claim of God on my life, decreed by God before I was formed in the womb? Do I sit and now again, another time, add to my own history of shame for the years I tried to do everything else but answer this call? Or do I stand and deny my gender? A preacher I am, a brother I am not. I finally resolved the violent conflict by standing, because when I stood as I am, I stood in the total authenticity of my being. Black, preacher, Baptist, woman. For the same God who made me a preacher is the same God who made me a woman. And I am convinced that God was not confused on either count.
Dr. Laurene Jones was a basketball athlete, girls basketball coach, and Title IX champion of girls in sports. She said to me during our interview, my girls came with baggage. They came from places where padlocks and evictions were many. Laurene believed that the ethic of equality did not exclude Blacks and girls in sports. And if that meant going to battle against racial and gender injustice, she was quick to do so because she was up for the fight. Laurene also believed in possibilities, that the world could be a better place and that her young charges could reach the stars. To me, there's nothing more important, more inspiring than belief in the possibility of others. Laurene grew up in Brewery Town in Philadelphia. She was actually very, well, I should say, very, very rambunctious as a teenager. That was up until she was told by her church's pastor that she was adopted. It was designed as an intervention, an admonishment to love and respect those who took it upon themselves to love you. That was essentially what the pastor said to her. Those words really changed the focus and direction of Laurene's life. She almost became a different person. She definitely was the better person that she was already on the road to becoming. She was later inspired by Dr. Ruth Wright Hare, who is in chapter 3 of They Carried Us. Dr. Hare was principal at William Penn High School for Girls. And Laurene said, when we walked in there, Dr. Hare told us that we were going to be the best people in the world. Laurene took that message to Morgan State College in Baltimore, where she, for the very first time in her life, discovered racial discrimination. That discrimination, uh, uh, I would say, confronted her when she was out one day with a friend, and they wanted to go to a local movie theater and coffee shop. Well, that was not allowed. Blacks were not allowed in either the movie theater or the coffee shop. Uh, Incensed by that, Laurene immediately went back to campus and she joined the student government. And in joining student government, what that meant was that she participated in student government-led protests and those led by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Laurene was actually jailed for 5 days at some point, and later, after being released, she participated in the historic 1963 March on Washington. Laurene was amongst a group of students who was hosed by police and attacked by dogs while protesting in Salisbury, Maryland. Years later, her name, along with others, is engraved in a walkway, on the campus of Morgan State College. That walkway leads to the downtown area where they once fought against racial discrimination. They also have pictures of all of the individual students on campus who participated in these acts of civil protest. There's a mural of all of their pictures and monument to their work to their work for equality. As a girls basketball coach, she was known as No Nonsense Jackson. Her students used to say of her, Miss Jackson don't play. Laurene took young girls into her home. She nurtured their academic and athletic growth, and she celebrated their achievements. Her motto, though, was books, basketball, boys, in that order. And when she discovered that there was a shorter playing season for girls, she pounced on the disparity. She met with the Office of Civil Rights and filed suit against the School District of Philadelphia for violation of Title IX law related to federal funding for educational institutions. That law mandated equal access to athletics and sports for women. To be clear, Dr. Laurene Jones is the reason why girls play all kinds of sports in schools in the city of Philadelphia. She was harassed, she received hate mail, she was blamed for causing trouble by male coaches, and along all the way, she did not back down. The Archdiocese pulled out of citywide title games with the district, and it was 30 years and she had retired by the time the School District of Philadelphia and the Archdiocese returned to title games. And those games at that point included games also played by girls. Laurene said of those experiences, especially coming off of the civil rights movement. That's what we fought for, equality. But as I said, I was much younger and naive. Who sues the people who sign their checks? I didn't think of it as something big. I never thought about it like that until many years later. I just thought I was doing the right thing and that we were following the federal law.
So we've gone deeper than we usually do into the lives of just a few of the 95 women who are profiled in They Carried Us. But all of the women in They Carried Us pursued what we are calling an ethic of equality. Their careers and their family lives were based on it. Sometimes they articulated it clearly, and sometimes it was just the way they lived their lives. It is ironic that men like Washington and Jefferson came to be identified with the ideals of freedom and equality, when these and other Black women were so deeply engaged in not just talking about it, but being about it. And when we say they carried us, this is what we mean.